Today, we talk about law in ancient Egypt on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Today, we are talking about law in ancient Egypt. Now, when we talk about law in ancient Egypt, it's a little different than when we talk about, say, law in ancient Mesopotamia. In ancient Mesopotamia, they had law codes, the most famous of which is the law of or code of Hammurabi. But there were other law codes too that long predated Hammurabi. In Egypt, the situation was a bit different. In Egypt, there were no law codes, at least none for most of Egypt's history. Its justice system was basically governed by a set of traditions that extended back to the earliest days of Egypt. And these traditions were just sort of almost automatically known to everyone. It was common knowledge. So everybody knew the rules and what to do in specific circumstances. Now, when we talk about law in ancient Egypt, it tends to break down into three kinds of proceedings. The one kind of proceeding is contract law, and contract law was very, very common in ancient Egypt. Basically, what would happen is a contract would be drawn between two parties, and then if there was a dispute over that contract, it would then go through the legal process. An example of this that was pretty typical in ancient Egypt was, say, renting a donkey. Now, this is the ancient equivalent of a car rental. You know, when you rent a car, you get this long contract with minuscule fine print and lots of stipulations. Well, donkey rental contracts were very, very similar. You know, a modern car contract might say you're not allowed to drive your vehicle to the USA or to Mexico. Likewise, there are donkey rental agreements that prevent the renter from taking the donkey out to Babylon. So there was, say, those sorts of limits in these rental contracts. But the other stipulation is that the donkey had to be returned alive. And the idea is that the owner would rent the donkey to the renter. The renter would work the donkey, and then he would return the donkey with a fee. Now, on rare occasions, that donkey was worked too hard and died in the care of the renter. Most of these contracts had a stipulation that said if the donkey died, then the renter owed the owner a certain amount of fee to replace the donkey. Well, it's when those contracts and those stipulations were triggered that things get interesting in the Egyptian judicial system. Because with these sorts of contract disputes, they were generally settled at the temples. Temples in ancient Egypt were not just religious institutions. They were judicial institutions and they were administrative institutions. So the first recourse for the owner to get the renter to pay up was to take the renter to court. Essentially, take him to the temple and have a priest judge over the matter. Typically, if the contract was clear, they would find in the case of the owner, and then the owner's problems are just beginning. Because at that point, he discovers how difficult it is to collect a debt in ancient Egypt. So, the owner has a judgment in his favor. He goes to the renter and says, hey, I've got a judgment to pay for you to pay up this amount of money for the donkey you killed. and the renter says, go away, I don't have to pay you. Okay, so then the owner of that donkey has to go back to the court and basically get another judgment saying to force the renter to pay the first judgment. Well, this repeats for several iterations in the judicial system and eventually goes up the ladder from, say, priests to magistrates to mayors to viziers to potentially even the king itself, although a donkey dispute never made it up to the king. It was usually settled before then. However, it was very, very difficult to collect on debts in ancient Egypt. Very, very difficult. So that gives you a little insight into, say, the contract law that legal proceedings that happened in ancient Egypt. Okay, so that's sort of your first class of legal proceedings, which is the contract law. Now, a second class of legal proceedings is what's sometimes called the civil infractions. These are, say, these could go anywhere from, say, minor trespasses to very, very serious crimes that affected the community at large, but didn't affect the king himself. A lot of these civil infractions were punished with just a beating. For example, if you were just some drunk that wandered into a temple and defiled sacred space, this was not considered to be a capital crime. This was more considered to be a civil infraction, and what they did was they basically take you out and they beat you. Now, we kind of have to understand the way that the Egyptians viewed beatings anyway, which is a little different than what we may perceive today. Beatings were liberally administered in ancient Egypt. Okay? The magistrates, the police officers, which are called magi, these people had broad authority to beat whoever they questioned. So they could haul somebody in and beat them for no good reason. Or they'll beat them prior to an interrogation so they can be assured that they get the truth when they ask their questions. So beatings were everywhere in ancient Egypt. It was a society that loved a good beating. So we find that to be very, very common all over the place. Masters who owned slaves could beat their slaves anytime they want. But interestingly enough, they were not permitted to kill their slaves because that was against the tradition. That oral tradition that went all the way back to the beginning of Egypt, supposedly. So there were limits to what, even slave masters could do with their slaves because of that oral tradition. So the high end of say, the civil infractions were crimes that affected the community at large. And these were crimes that were especially disruptive, that caused concern and strife amongst, say, a local population. An example of one of these was a priest that had slept with both the mother and the daughter and a whole bunch of other women in the community at Deir el-Medina. That was a priest who was really, really infamous for a variety of crimes. So his crimes had reached to a level where it caused community concern, and that community concern sort of translates into sort of the high level of civil infractions. Joseph, when he was sent to prison because of the attempted rape of Potiphar's wife, or at least that she claimed was rape. That was a civil infraction that violated community standards because it crossed the social strata barriers. And violating the social strata was considered to be serious enough that it called for really, really severe punishment. Now, in those particular cases where the crime was seen to be so grievous that something had to be done, those cases were essentially remanded to the king, and the king had to deal with it, because it was only the king who could administer the death penalty in that case, or some other really serious punishment. So that covers, say, the civil infractions. Now, when we get to that top tier, that third sort of level of legal proceedings, are what we could call maybe capital offenses or offenses against the king. And just like it sounds like, this is any offense that was done against the king of Egypt. If you're, for example, you steal a bronze toothpick from the king, you get the death penalty. You betray the king by swearing an oath against him, treason, you get the death penalty. If you steal a grape off of the king's table, death penalty. Didn't matter what it was. If it was an offense against the king, it resulted in the death penalty. That was the only recourse for infractions against the king himself. So, we have there then the three sort of classes of legal proceedings. Contract law, civil infractions, and then capital offenses. So, when we then look at, say, later legal developments in the 18th and 19th dynasty, we do see a slight shift here, which is very interesting. At the end of the 18th dynasty, with the reign of Horemheb, we find the first legal code that was made in Egypt. And the purpose of this legal code was to prevent administrators from being corrupt. During the Amarna period, there was a lot of corruption. Administrators and scribes were taking bribes, administering unfair justice, scales were unequally weighed, and this had been a lot of concern to, say, Horemheb's administration. Now, Horemheb was a general. He was a law and order kind of guy. Even though Egypt didn't have any codified laws, he liked the order. And for him, this was really, really important. So for Horemheb, he routed out the corruption that had been so common during the Amarna period. Because during the Amarna period, Akhenaten and his successors had sort of a tolerance for institutionalized corruption. So, administrators were on the take. Viziers were on the take. Local governments were on the take. Everyone had their hand out to receive a bribe. Horemheb tried to put a stop to that by imposing a severe fine on anyone who gathered ill-gotten gains. But that wasn't the end of the legal reforms in the Egyptian New Kingdom. In Dynasty 19, we also see a kind of legal precedent that we don't see earlier, which is law by, say, ontological principle. What we see here is the principle of Ma'at start to take effect at the beginning of Dynasty 19. Now, we kind of have to understand that the kings of Dynasty 19, most of them were worshipping the god Seth. They were from the Delta, from the Nile Delta, and specifically from around the city of Avaris. But that was tempered against a different god, which was Ma'at. So, this new religious program of the kings of the 19th dynasty, an elevation of the goddess Ma'at and with that, respect for balance, social order, and wholeness in the society. So, what we have, say, from the kings like Seti I, Ramses I, Ramses II, even, say, Seti II, is this heightened respect for order in society. So, for the first time in Egyptian society, there was more than just a tradition. There was actually a principle that was put in place that acted as kind of a general law. A general, almost kind of like a love your neighbor as yourself maxim. The golden rule. Except the golden rule in ancient Egypt was order and balance. And this sort of golden mean, as it were, proved to be highly effective in the governance of Egyptian society during the late New Kingdom, the dynasty 19 and 20. And we also find that this also further carries on. And we even find this being used all the way up into the last days of the Ptolemaic period. We find examples of it at Dendaric Temple. So we find this sort of interesting trajectory in Egyptian society, where from this sort of shady early beginnings of Egyptian society comes a tradition that has no structure but is a way of dealing with people in the courts and is implemented all the way through to the reign of Horemheb, where we start to see the first law, and with that, a law of principle, of balance, of ma'at. And that law then becomes sort of the guiding principle that is used in Egypt through the rest of its history until Roman times and the advent of Roman law in Egypt. So anyway, I hope you found that interesting and educational. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.